Two women climbed out of a life raft at my dock on the foggiest night Rockland, Maine had seen in 20 years. They were shaking, soaked through, and completely out of options. Every single light in the harbor was off. Nobody came out. I almost didn't either, but I did. And 3 weeks later, their father stood in my workshop in a coat that cost more than my truck, ready to take them home. He had already made up his mind about me. I was nobody. Then something slipped out of my apron, hit the concrete floor, and his whole face changed. But let me start from the beginning. My name is Sullivan Marsh. Most people call me Sully. I'm 27 years old, and I live in a small cottage at the end of a dead-end road about 200 yards from the harbor in Rockland, Maine. It's the kind of town where the salt air gets into the wood, into the shingles, into the boats, into you. Lobster traps stack up along the docks like little walls, and the seagulls own every square foot of sidewalk from May to October. The cottage belonged to my grandfather, Ezra Marsh. He raised me here after my mother left when I was 8. I say left, but that's not exactly the right word. She didn't leave me at home. She left me at a gas station on Route 1, about 40 minutes north, told me to wait by the door while she went inside. I stood there for 3 hours before the cashier called someone. My grandfather drove up that night, walked in, found me sitting on a bench next to the ice machine with my backpack between my feet. He didn't say much, just put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You're home now. That's all that matters." She never came back, and after a while I stopped expecting her to. I never knew my father. No name, no picture, no story. Just a blank space where a person should have been, but Ezra filled the rest. He was a boat builder, not the kind who works at a big shipyard with machines doing half the job. The kind who could run his hand along a plank of cedar and tell you exactly where it wanted to bend. He built the workshop on the harbor in 1968 and spent the next 45 years restoring wooden boats for collectors up and down the Maine coast. Sailboats, sloops, yawls, old runabouts, the kind of boats most people only see in museums. Ezra brought them back to life with patience, sawdust, a stubbornness that looked a lot like love. He had a saying he repeated so often, it might as well have been carved into the wall. A boat isn't finished when there's nothing left to add. It's finished when there's nothing left to take away. Said it about boats, about woodwork, about life. I heard it 1,000 times. I never really understood it. Ezra's heart gave out when I was 24. A Wednesday afternoon. He was sanding the hull of a sloop, and he just didn't get up. I found him on the shop floor with the sandpaper still in his hand. I kept the business going. Marsh Boatworks. Same dock, same tools, same clients. But the work has been drying up. A bigger shop, North Atlantic Restoration, opened in Camden last year. Modern facility, hydraulic lifts, a website with drone footage. They've been pulling clients I've had for years. I'm 2 months behind on dock rent. The only thing keeping me going is a 1928 Herreshoff sailboat I need to finish for a collector in Bar Harbor. If that check comes through, I buy another month. If it doesn't, the math just stops. I drive a 1991 Ford Ranger. Red, mostly under the rust. Every morning, I drive past the big summer houses on the peninsula where my clients live behind hedges I couldn't afford to trim, and come home to a cottage where the porch steps creak in a different spot every season. I touch beautiful things every single day with my hands. I just don't get to keep any of them. If you're the kind of person who believes that the things we build with our hands say more about us than anything we could ever say with words, you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay with us. What happened next is something I still think about every night when the fog rolls in. Nights I don't do much. I had a girlfriend once. Lasted 5 months. She said, I wasn't all the way there. She wasn't wrong. When your mother leaves you at a gas station before you're old enough to understand why, you learn something about anchors. You learn that people aren't one. I keep one thing in the front pocket of my work apron. An old hand plane with a cedar handle darkened from decades of use. The initials EMR carved into the grip. It was the first tool Ezra ever bought when he opened the shop. Too worn for real work, but he carried it every day. This one shaped the first boat that left this shop, he used to say. You don't get rid of what started you. I carry it now. Some people wear crosses. I carry a hand plane with my grandfather's initials cut into the wood. If that sounds strange, you probably grew up with more people to hold on to. That night started, like most October nights on the coast, cold, damp air that crawls under your collar. The forecast had warned about fog all week. I was in the workshop past 11, varnishing the Hurashoff's deck. The boat was almost done. 3 more days and I could deliver it and keep the lights on for 1 more month. That thought was the only warm thing in the building. Then the fog came in. Not slowly. A wall. 1 minute I could see the harbor lights. The next, nothing. Just white. The foghorn on the breakwater started up, low and steady. I sealed the varnish, covered the boat, and headed for the door. Almost locked up right there. Almost walked home and went to bed. But something made me leave the shop light on. Just a feeling. I left the fluorescent burning and the door unlocked. I made it halfway to the cottage when I heard it. Wood hitting wood. Hollow, urgent, coming from the dock behind the shop. I turned back with a flashlight. The fog was so thick the beam barely cut 10 feet. Then I saw them. 2 figures at the end of the dock crouched low. A bright orange life raft tied to the piling. They were hitting the dock with an oar, trying to get anyone to come out. Every instinct said walk away. Harbor at night, fog, strangers. But I raised the flashlight. When the beam hit their faces, I saw it. Not dangerous. Just afraid, shaking, soaked, lips turning blue. I've worn that face. Standing somewhere with nobody coming, I know exactly what it looks like. Can I help you? The taller one stood up. Our sailboat hit something about a mile out. It went down fast. We barely made it to the raft. We've been rowing for over an hour. Yours was the only light on the whole harbor. I looked behind me. Every shed, every dock, every house along the waterfront. Dark. Come in. They stepped into the workshop and the whole room changed. Not the walls, not the tools. Something in the air. Like a room that had been holding its breath for 3 years, suddenly let it go. I'm Hadley. Hadley Ashworth. And this is my sister, Blythe. The name meant nothing to me that night. It would later. And when it did, it would explain everything. Blythe was 24. Dark curly hair, the kind of energy that fills a room even when she's soaking wet. She smiled through the cold. I'm so sorry about your floor. I feel like we dragged the entire Atlantic Ocean into your shop. This floor has seen worse. Trust me, Hadley was different. 28. Blonde hair darkened by water. All sharp features. A posture that stayed composed, even dripping on a stranger's dock. She didn't fill silence. She occupied it. Her eyes moved across the workshop the way someone reads a space when they're used to thinking about how things are built. Phones were out. Both the landline and cell. Fog had swallowed everything. I made coffee. Cheap stuff from a can, the kind that tastes like it's doing you a favor just by being warm. Ezra used to keep it stocked for long nights in the shop. Fog coffee, he called it. I hadn't made it for anyone else since he was gone. Pouring 3 cups instead of 1 felt strange. Like a muscle I hadn't used in years, suddenly being asked to work again. We sat on crates near the shop stove, foghorn sounding outside like a heartbeat. Blythe talked easily about the sailing trip, the boat hitting a ledge, rowing through fog, hoping for a light. Then she said something that stuck. How many boats did you pass before mine? Blythe looked at Hadley. Hadley looked at her mug. All of them, Hadley said. Every light in the harbor was off. An entire harbor. Not one light. The only difference between me and all those dark windows was a feeling. I couldn't explain that told me to leave the shop light burning. That thought kept me awake. But another one came with it. One I didn't expect. What if I hadn't left it on? What would have happened to them? And what would I have missed? The conversation went deeper than it should have for 3 strangers sharing bad coffee at midnight. At one point, Blythe went to use the bathroom in the cottage, and Hadley asked to see the Hurashoff. I pulled the tarp back. She walked around the boat slowly, her hand floating above the hull. Then her fingers brushed the bow I'd spent 3 weeks shaping by hand, not casually. The way someone touches something they understand. You did this. Over 3 months, by hand, mostly. It's extraordinary. 2 words. But they made the shop feel different, like someone had finally walked in and seen what I saw every day. Not a failing business in a leaky shed. Something worth caring about. That loneliness lifted for about 30 seconds. And 30 seconds was enough to remind me what it felt like. By 2 in the morning, they were both asleep. The shop didn't feel empty. That was a dangerous thought. People leave. Warmth is borrowed. But the sound of other people breathing turned the silence into something that felt more like a pause. And a pause means something comes next. Morning came clean and bright. I made eggs, toast, coffee. Blythe ate like she was training for something. I drove them to Camden to their car. When Hadley got out, she turned back. Thank you for leaving the light on, Sully. She wasn't just talking about the shop light. I could tell. And the fact that I could tell scared me more than the fog had. I went home, washed the mugs, then stopped. Put them on the shelf above the sink, separate from the others. Everything was exactly the same as 24 hours before. But the absence of 2 people I'd known for 12 hours weighed more than 3 years of silence. That was the quietest Saturday I'd had in a long time. I had no idea what was coming the following Friday. A week passed. Delivered the Hareshoff. Paid the dock rent. Took on a small dory restoration. Enough for 2 weeks of groceries. I noticed I kept glancing at the dock. Thursday night, I moved those 2 mugs to the cottage kitchen next to mine. Friday evening, knock at the door. Blythe grinning, holding donuts from a bakery in Camden I couldn't afford. Behind her, Hadley with 2 coffees, trying very hard to look casual. We were in the area. Camden is 30 minutes away. That's basically the area. It's just like that. It became a thing. Weekends, sometimes both. Sometimes just Hadley. Blythe brought food and chaos, tried to help in the shop, and ended up with varnish in her hair. I'm helping, she said, holding a brush she'd been using backwards. Hadley brought coffee and quiet. She'd sit on the old couch and watch me work. Her questions were always the right ones. Never, what are you doing? Always, why this joint and not that one? Never, how long does it take? Always, how do you know when it's done? Something clicks, I said. There's nothing left to take away. Ezra's words repeated like a reflex. I started buying real coffee. Beans from a roaster in Rockport. Told myself it was for me. I caught myself setting out 3 mugs one morning. 3. The last time I did that. Ezra was alive. Something was building. We both felt it. But the thing that could break it was somewhere out there, getting closer. I just didn't know what it looked like yet. One afternoon, Blythe was in the kitchen making what she called Maine lobster rolls, which was bread, mayo, and whatever she found in my fridge. This is basically a sadness sandwich, she announced. I'm going to patent it. Hadley was in the shop. I was under the dory when she spoke. Sully. Why do you live out here alone? Because people leave. And it's easier to get used to quiet than to get used to losing someone. Oh. She didn't flinch. Just nodded, like she'd done the same math. My mother left me at a gas station when I was 8, I said. I hadn't planned to. The words just came, the way things do when someone has been sitting in your silence. Long enough that the silence starts to trust them. Hadley was quiet for a long time. Then she said, So you keep the shop because it's the last thing that stayed. Not a question. The most accurate thing anyone had ever said about my life. If you've ever had someone see the one thing about you that you've never been able to say out loud, drop the word light in the comments. Just that word. I'd love to know how many of us have been standing in the fog waiting for someone to see us. Hadley started staying longer. Wednesdays, Thursdays, laptop on the kitchen table. We'd eat together, sit on the porch, watch the harbor go from gold to silver to dark. She'd come to the shop sometimes just to sit and read while I worked. She said the sound of hand tools on wood was the most calming thing she'd heard in years. I started noticing things that didn't add up. Her jacket, real leather, stitching tight. The watch on her wrist. The way she talked about family in pieces that never fit together. One evening, Blythe mentioned Dad's yacht in the Med before catching herself. Hadley looked at her plate. I didn't push. Everyone has rooms they keep locked. But the pieces were forming a picture I hadn't asked to see. Then one night, past midnight, Blythe asleep, Hadley set down her mug and started talking, not in her usual careful way, in a voice that sounded like something breaking open. Her father was Victor Ashworth. Ashworth Maritime. Luxury yachts. Newport, Rhode Island. Hundreds of millions. She said the name like it was something stuck in her throat. She was a naval engineer. MIT, top of her class. But her title was Associate Project Coordinator. She designed 3 award-winning yachts. The credit went to Ashworth Maritime Design Team. She asked her father once. He said the brand is bigger than any one person. Sailing trip wasn't a vacation. Her father had been negotiating a merger with Kensington Yachts. Part of the arrangement, Hadley would marry the Kensington's eldest son. She found out at a dinner when their lawyer mentioned the arrangement during appetizers. Like she was a line in the contract. I got in the car the next morning. Blythe followed because that's what Blythe does. She looked at me. We kept going until the fog stopped us. And then I rode to your dock. Every wall I'd built over 19 years told me to stay where I was. But every empty room I'd carried since Ezra told me something different. The house has a spare room. If you need a place to figure out what comes next, the door's open. No conditions. Are you sure? I wasn't. Every nerve was screaming, yeah, I'm sure. I had no idea if I just made the best decision of my life or the worst. I wouldn't find out from Hadley. I'd find out from the man in the Escalade. Hadley stayed. The cottage filled up quietly. Her mug next to mine. Her jacket on the shop chair. Her drawings mixing with my blueprints. She worked on consulting projects. I restored boats. We'd eat together, sit on the porch. She said the sound of hand tools on wood was the most calming thing she'd heard in years. One afternoon, she showed me a sketch, a structural redesign of the workshop. New trusses, insulation, drainage, expanded floor space. Just playing around. Your roof leaks on the north side. It's driving me crazy. The drawing was clean, precise, professional. Load calculations in the margins. You're really good at this. I know. Nobody's ever let me prove it. The distance between us kept getting smaller. Her shoulder against mine on the porch steps. My eyes on her face a beat too long. One night she asked, "What are you afraid of, Sully?" That this is temporary. That I'll get used to someone in the next room, and then one morning it'll be quiet again. I'm afraid of the same thing, she said. Except in my version, the room is full of people, and I'm still invisible. I lay awake thinking about that. 2 different kinds of empty rooms, and we'd ended up on the same porch. I didn't know yet that the thing we were both afraid of was already driving north on I-95 in a black Escalade, and it wasn't coming to ask questions. It was coming to collect what it believed it owned. Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the fog, I was on the dock rinsing salt off the finished dory. October at its best, leaves burning red and gold, water bright blue. Then I heard the engine. Low, heavy, expensive. A black Escalade pulled up to the dock. Victor Ashworth stepped out. Tall, silver hair, navy wool overcoat, shoes that cost more than my monthly rent. He looked at the cottage, the workshop, then at me in my apron with sawdust in my hair. Where are my daughters? Hadley appeared at the shop door, face white, Blythe behind her. The merger closes in 10 days. Get your things. We're leaving. I'm not part of that arrangement, Dad. You're an Ashworth. You're part of every arrangement. His eyes shifted to me. Quick, thorough. The way you look at something you've already decided has no value. I don't know what you've told my daughters, but I'd suggest you step aside. I didn't tell them anything. They rode to my dock in fog so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Every other light was off. Since that night, they're the ones who keep showing up. I've never asked them for a single thing. Then I said one more thing. Instead of asking why they're here, you should be asking why they don't want to be there. Hadley stepped forward. I'm not a clause in a merger, Dad. I'm a naval engineer. A good one. Blythe beside her. She's right. And I'm done watching you treat her like a line item. And Victor did something I didn't expect. He walked past all three of us and into the workshop. I followed, not sure what he was doing. Hadley and Blythe stayed on the dock, watching. Inside, Victor moved slowly. His eyes traveled across the space. Not the way he'd looked at the cottage, with that quick dismissal. This was different. Closer to attention. He stopped at the dory, ran his hand along the gunnel, examined the planking, the joints, the hardware I'd polished. He looked at the tools, the workbench scarred from 50 years of use, the photo of Ezra on the wall. Who taught you this? My grandfather, Ezra Marsh. 45 years in this shop. Victor pointed at the dory. This isn't repair. It's craftsmanship. That's what my grandfather called it. He reached into his coat for a card. As he did, I shifted, and the hand plane slipped from my apron. It hit the concrete floor with a crack that echoed off every wall. Victor picked it up before I could. His fingers found the initials carved into the cedar. EME stared at the letters. Then at the photo of Ezra on the wall. Ezra Marsh, he said softly. Ezra Marsh restored a 1938 Concordia yawl for my father in 1992. I was 25. I came to this harbor to pick it up. Your grandfather spent 2 hours walking us through every detail. My father said it was the finest work he'd ever seen on a wooden boat. He paused. His thumb traced the initials. That yawl is still in my collection. It's one of the 3 that need work. I've been looking for someone who could match the original quality for over a decade. I didn't know this shop was still here. He held the plane out to me. The handle was warm. I'm not offering charity. 9 vessels. 18 months. Fair market rate? The work stays in this shop. 2 conditions, I said. The work goes out under Marsh Boatworks. My grandfather's name stays on every piece. And Hadley gets credited as structural engineer on every plan she draws. Her name, not a team. Victor studied me for a long time. Then something crossed his face that wasn't authority or control. It was respect. Your grandfather said something similar in 1992. He said the name on the hull is the name of the man who built it. That's not negotiable. It still isn't. Fair enough. We shook hands. Firm, a beat longer than business, he walked out. Stopped in front of Hadley. The merger goes forward. Without you attached, and the contract is real. Based on the work, her eyes filled. She held steady. He got in the Escalade and pulled away, past the lobster shacks and the bait shops and the seagull watching from a piling. Blythe left Sunday. Hugged me on the dock hard enough to lift me. Don't mess this up, she whispered. Mess what up? She just grinned. Hadley stayed. She called her father the next week. Long conversation. Afterward, sat on the porch. He's sending the Concordia first. The one your grandfather restored? Ezra's boat. Coming home. 32 years later. The roof needs work before he ships it. Already drew the plans. Full redesign? You're really going to do this? I'm really going to do this. And you're going to let me, because your north wall has been leaning 2 degrees off center, and it's keeping me up at night. We didn't talk about what we were. Some things break if you push them into a box with a label. They do better in the open air between 2 people who just keep showing up. She worked on the porch while I worked in the shop. Evenings we'd cook together. Whatever was in the fridge, plus whatever she'd picked up at the farmer's market. We'd eat on the porch, the October evening settling around us like a wool blanket. Waves against the rocks below. A neighbor's radio playing something old through an open window. One night, sun dropped behind the hills and turned the harbor a color that belonged on a postcard nobody would believe. She reached over and took my hand. Didn't say anything. Thumb resting across my knuckles. I didn't pull away. For the first time in 19 years, someone reached and I let them. That night I put our mugs side by side on the shelf above the sink, not in the cabinet. On the shelf where Ezra kept his. Weeks later, she asked what I wanted to do first with the advance. I looked at the 1991 Ford Ranger. Rust, cracked windshield, the truck that carried me through everything. I think I'm going to restore that truck. It's earned it, she smiled. About time. The evening hummed around us. Crickets along the harbor wall. The shop light glowing warm across the dock. Salt air and cedar. I reached into my apron and felt the hand plain, the worn handle, the initials. Everything my grandfather started in this shop 45 years ago, Ezra used to say. A boat isn't finished when there's nothing left to add. It's finished when there's nothing left to take away. I spent most of my life thinking that meant keeping things empty. Staying alone because alone was clean and safe and nobody could leave if nobody was there. But sitting on that porch with Hadley beside me and the workshop glowing behind us, in a 1938 Concordia on its way home to the shop where it was born, I finally understood what Ezra really meant. You don't build walls to keep the fog out. You build a light. And the ones that matter, the ones worth everything, are the ones who follow it in.